Hello there, I am Brent Nelson, presenting on behalf of my colleagues, Craig Harkema, who is co-investigator on this part of the project, Kyle Days, PhD student and research assistant on the project, Ryan Gajowski, who was an MA student and RA on this project at the time, now a PhD student, and Daryl Friesen, the programmer who has built this wonderful piece of software for us. A bit of context before we get into the demo. This event builder has been built in the service of a project called the Social Network of Early Modern Collections of Curiosities, which is in turn part of a larger project on the culture of curiosity 1580 to 1700. The project pertains to what you see displayed here, collections of curiosities in the early modern period and their representations in historical documents. Specifically, in this part of the project, we are interested in the social network of collecting, the people involved in accumulating, acquiring, transmitting, in some cases creating, locating these objects and circulating them among themselves. So we are wanting to put the GoPro on the object and follow it through this network and all the people involved in its collection. So in the first instance, we are interested in not the objects themselves, but their representation in historical documents. So in some cases, we are talking about a one-to-many relationship where the real-world object might be represented in any number of documents. So in our data, in the database that captures these objects and their various mentions, we have a real-world name for an object curated by us, and it points to all of the places where that object in any sort of event whatsoever is represented, and in some cases named or represented in quite different terms. So again, very importantly, we are interested in mentions of objects in documents, and it is the event coming out of that documentary representation, that mention, that we are capturing. So just to give you a sense of the data and how it's structured in order to make sense of how the event builder works, here's a case of a collected object represented in a donor list at the Anatomy School in Oxford. There is an object donated by a Dr. Bathurst, president of Trinity College, and that object is a large bear's foot from Greenland. So those of you who know the TEI can very quickly understand that we mark the name of the person and we give it a ref with an attribute or a value that points to that person in our database. Similarly, for places, we have Trinity College mentioned, and again a reference to that entry in our database. And similarly for Greenland, in this case, the source of the object. Somewhat more complicated is the way we handle objects. So again, we're interested in every mention of an object and everything that is said about that object within that context of the mention. So to capture that, we use a seg element, which might include and would include all of those entities, including the object itself. So this is a mention of an object. Each mention of the object or object set or object group receives an XML ID related to that document. And within that mention, we have what we call a handle, analogous to a person's name. And that is marked with a reference string with a type attribute that matches the value in the type attribute for the seg. So this is an object that corresponds to the seg with the type equals object embedded within the seg. The function of that RS string is to give our eye something to focus on, something to grab onto to see what the object being mentioned is. So you put it all together and we have the container, which identifies the mention of the object. It gives an XML ID to that object as distinct from an object group or an object set. We have the name of the person involved, the name of place associated with that person, the RS string that identifies the object that's being talked about, and then another name that in this case is the source place for that object. So the event builder uses the structure of the XML document to identify the people, the places, dates, which we haven't mentioned here, and also the objects that will be put together into articulated events. In some cases it draws from the database, but principally drawing from the XML document. Not represented here is the object within the database which articulates that one-to-many relationship. A name and an ID for the real world object that may or may not still exist, but then correlated to that, all of the XML IDs that are drawn from the various documents that mention or talk about that object. The user begins by selecting the document, and the document from the XML is displayed in the left side of the screen, and you can see that the elements that will be used to build events are highlighted in certain ways. People are highlighted in blue. In front of the string of text is the word person, identifies it as person number 30. The 30 comes from the @ref attribute attached to, in our case, name type equals person. So this is pointing to person number 30 in our database. In the database is where we keep the biographical information on, in this case, John Bargrave. So John Bargrave in our project is person number 30. Similarly for places, except in this case highlighted in green, dates aren't represented in the database, just in the XML, so they're just highlighted in pink, but again selectable in building events. And crucially, centrally for our project, we are interested in the object. And again, this is pulling from our seg and corresponding RS structure. So barcat 00020 is the XML ID attached to a seg which has a type equals object. Corresponding to that type equals object is an RS string which gives us the name, or in our nomenclature, the handle, in this case Romulus, a figure, a piece of statuary in the figure of Romulus, and identified as an object. You can also then select, in fact you need to select in order to start building events, the context that you want to work in. You can look at the div structure, but in this case, because this is a list with items, the div is going to contain many, many, many items, therefore many, many mentions. So that context is too large, but for some documents that are structured that way, that is the best way to look at them. In our case, we are dealing with items in a list. So the yellow box demarcates the part of the text identified by the item element, but even more specific for our purposes, the seg identifies each mention of an object. So this will provide the context, in most cases, all of the elements that we need to build an event. If some entity is referenced outside of the context of that seg, you can go out to a broader context, for example a div, and you'll be able to then select the item in that context. Crucially, you will need to select the collector, because in most cases the document does not continually, perpetually reference the collector in every piece of context. So in this context, Bargrave is nowhere to be found, yet he is the principal participant in these events, in that he is the person who acquired each and every one of these objects and brought them into his collection. So we want in every instance to be able to point to Bargrave, include him in the event, and say Bargrave collected this object. So by selecting Bargrave up front, he will always be present in every view as we build the events. Again, one more step prior to building individual events, we can add in a batch all of the objects in the document and build for every one of them the basic event, which is John Bargrave acquired that object. So let's go down to a sample that is not too simple, not too complex, and we'll see what the event builder pane looks like. Okay, so here in item number 00250 we have 3 segs. We have 2 groups individually mentioned. We've got a group of cinders, we have a group of stones, and together those 2 groups constitute another single group, and that is indicated by XML ID 00260. Each of those individual groups have their own XML IDs, the RS string corresponding to each of them to help us to identify exactly what they are. We have a place in Mount Etna, we've got a place in Sicily, and we've got another person mentioned here, Lord Winchelsea, a noble friend of John Bargrave's. In the right-hand side, we have the menu that helps us to build the various events. We have 4 main classes of events. We have acquisition, production, manipulation, and observation. We are not trying to capture every potential act, event associated with an object. They are in some ways too diverse, but in many ways they are actually pretty consistently narrow. Usually it's an acquisition either of the type of donation or gift, or a purchase if it's some other kind of acquisition, if somebody steals an object or something like that, or we just don't know, then we have the other option. For events of production, we have only 2 main types. Natural production, that could be anything like Etna producing cinders, or it could be a body producing something like gallstones. And of course, an artificial production would be an artist or an artisan or craftsperson or somebody making an artifactual object. Events of manipulation most commonly involve transmission, moving of objects from one place or one person to another, an intermediary like a courier, or extraction. Again, often this is a natural process, an extraction of cinders from Etna or of a gallstone or kidney stone or something from a patient. Those kinds of things ended up in collections. And then, of course, there is the catch-all category of other. Observation is just a simple act of seeing and looking at. Typically, a visitor to a collection often will record the things they saw in a list, so that person, for each object, there would be an event of looking at, observing that object. You'll notice that once you select a type, in this case, we're going to say it's an acquisition, it's donation. I'm going to say donation. This is a little bit of an act of interpretation because Bargrave doesn't explicitly say so in his catalog, but he references Lord Winchelsea as a noble friend. Given the difference in class, I doubt that Lord Winchelsea would have sold these objects to his friend, probably a gift. The source is Bargrave's friend, the recipient Bargrave. Bargrave is always present and available in these menus for building events associated with his catalog. And then you can choose the objects. A little bit here about how they are represented. You will see, of course, there is the XML string that correlates to the view in the left. There is the RS string for the bottom two cases that is pulled directly from the XML RS elements, the cinders, and then the stones. But above that, and this is for the group, what we do is we concatenate the RS strings from the contained RS values, the contained RS strings that are marked. So in this case, cinders and stones. And then in addition to that, we have a representation from the database, which does the job of correlating the real-world object with all of the various mentions of that object in the various documents. So this is adding more view, more detail, more information for the user about the nature of those objects. Because these objects were collected or acquired by Lord Winchelsea seemingly in one moment as a group, we're going to consider this as being one event, and we'll just build one event of acquisition for the group, not two events for the individual groups embedded inside of the seg with the XML value of 00260. The place of Sicily is not related to the moment or the event of acquisition, so we leave that blank and we don't have a date, and we add the event. One other event that occurred before Bargrave's acquisition of these objects was Lord Winchelsea's acquisition of the objects. And we treat that as a manipulation of getting the objects prior to them entering into a collection. So in this case, the type is an extraction. He pulled the rocks out of a site, out of Mount Etna. And again, it was Lord Winchelsea that did it. We can treat, again, the two groups of objects together as themselves a group. The place of origin is Mount Etna. We don't have a destination, no date, and we again add the event. So you can go down and look at the events that you have built. It will report, in this case, the extraction, and there is an error here. That should say manipulation, not acquisition, so we're going to have to edit that. The source, Lord Winchelsea, the recipient, John Bargrave, and the place where the extraction occurred. And similarly for the event of the donation. If you're not happy with those events, you can delete them, build new ones. So that's a sort of quick and dirty demonstration of how this process goes. In some more complex instances, you might have 2, 3, maybe even 4 events involved in Bargrave's mention of an object. He likes to include context. Other documents, much more simple. In some cases, just a simple acquisition. So-and-so acquired an object for their collection. So that's Event Builder. I would like to show you now a companion, a bit of software, the Event Browser. Event Browser was built by Daryl, our programmer. It was built as a way of keeping track of and viewing the events he was building as he was developing the software for the Event Builder. And then it occurred to him that maybe the team, as users and builders of events, might find this as a useful way for going back and checking our work. And then in turn, it occurred to us that this might be a good way for the public eventually to be able to have a different way into our data, an event-oriented view that enables them to sort by people, places, and most importantly, perhaps by objects. So at the outset, it looks kind of similar to the event builder, but wait, once we get going, it looks really quite a bit different. So you can look at all the events that have been built. You can sort by the event, no you can't, by the event ID, but you can just browse down all the events that have been built in the order in which they have been built, and it reports to you the kind of event, the type, people involved, places, the objects involved, and date, and so on. Daryl built these events, so they're all wrong. But that's okay. These things weren't acquired in 1662. But it does give a nice view of what it would look like if you did have the full range of elements involved in an event. So from that perspective, it looks awesome. You can also view according to people, the people involved, and this is just giving a view of all the people in our database in or alphabetical order by last name. Not terribly helpful, but if you want to zero in on Bargrave, you can do that. Look at all of the events associated with him, and then you can focus in on just events of acquisition or events of production. There should be, well, there is one apparently. Events of manipulation or observation. You can also search according to places. Mount Etna. And you'll see that there is one event related to Mount Etna. We could go back and search by people for Lord Winchelsea. We could find the event that way. And then you can go in by objects, and in each of the views there is the opportunity, the ability to sort by, in this case, the identifier. That's helpful because all of the objects have a preface that is a short form for the document. So if you wanted to just look at objects in a particular document, you could zero in by searching for the preface, or the prefix, pardon me. And you can also then sort by the name of the object. So that is Event Browser, a way to look at the events, a way to find your way into the data through people, places, and objects. And that is the sum total of the demonstration for today. We would be very, very happy to entertain any questions you have, talk more about the tools and how they might be used. Thank you very much.